revision process in ISO for many of the standards that we use in that ESIP members use. The biggest of those changes was the part 1 of 19115, which actually became a standard in 2013, I think it was. Since that time, we've had a couple of revisions and amendments as part of the so I can get back to this. Part of the evolution process, and of course, being able to evolve metadata standards is very important, and evolution is good. So there are really 3 things that have happened. 19115-1 has been amended. 19157 has been amended. So the amendments are small changes in standards that emerge for some reason. They go through the same, they go through an approval process, but it's not a revision of the whole standard. It's an amendment of the standard. Usually, I'll show you some examples of single things that have been added. And 19115-2 was a revision, so that was a major revision. And with quite a few additions. A lot of times we think about ISO standards as being created out there by some group that we have a little impact on. In almost all of these cases, we actually did have some impact. We were NASA and NOAA at various times were represented by myself and a couple others at ISO meetings. So in the old days, when, for instance, 19115-2 was first created, NASA and NOAA really were not participating in the process. So that's the difference between doing standards and having standards done to you. And I think in these cases, we're actually doing standards, and requirements that we have are getting into the standards. So that's good. This is, I sent out a Word document that has these pictures with annotations. And, of course, ISO has a fairly rich UML model. But in this case, I've put in the new things as red, and the context that those things occur in is the surrounding UML. And at the top of each page, there's something called something like a use case. So we all know that ISO has a number of identifiers that are spread throughout the standard, and they could be identifying citations. They could be identifying, those could be DOIs, for example. They could be identifying metadata records. They could be identifying algorithms. They could be identifying issues that users have, all kinds of things. One thing that was not there was an identifier for people or organizations. And an identifier for people or organizations doesn't exist in other earth science metadata standards. It emerged in DataCite, and in the last couple of years with the creation of ORCID and personal identifiers or identifiers of people. So we were able to add into ISO an identifier for a party, as you can see in this other UML. A party can be an individual or an organization. So right now, I think those party identifiers would typically be ORCID IDs, but they could be other things as well. That's an example of an amendment. It was sort of a small thing. We've been thinking a lot about variable metadata lately, and some discussions with the Airborne Metadata Working Group at NASA, and also the NetCDF community. We have a lot of situations where you have data sets with different spatial representations within a single file. So one example of that is in a lot of ocean data sets, where you have a data set that provides something for multiple depths in the ocean, as well as latitude and longitude. And those oceanic, sort of wet ocean parameters are given as three-dimensional data sets. And then there might be a data set in there which is a bathymetry model for the ocean floor, and also a ocean surface topography model just for the surface of the ocean. So those two reference data sets would be two-dimensional, latitude and longitude, while the ocean data set, and of course the same thing is true for atmospheric data sets, would be a three-dimensional data set. So in NetCDF land or HDF land, you use either a coordinates attribute in CF or a shape to describe the shape of those variables in a given file, and those shapes can be different. So in ISO, we do that with a scope element added to the spatial representation. So this allows you to say, this spatial representation, one of the options for scope is attribute or variable. In ISO, variables are called attributes, and then it allows you to list the attributes that this spatial representation corresponds to. Another small detail for having metadata for files that have lots of different variables or parameters in them. Talking with Gao Chen and other AeroMag or airborne metadata people, we needed ways to group variables. Over here on the left, we added into 19115-1 this idea of an attribute group, which is a group of variables. But the way that the fill values were defined, much higher up in the structure. So if you wanted to group variables with different fill values, that was a problem. You had to use two different mechanisms for grouping them. In order to allow the different fill values in the same group, the fill value description, which is called a range element description, became part of each variable rather than part of each group. So that gives us another the ability to describe in the same group data sets that have multiple fill values or data sets that have different fill values. We've always been able to do multiple fill values for the same data sets. But you might have a group of variables, some of which are integers and some of which are floating point numbers, and you therefore might have different fill values for those two things in the same group. Coverage quality is important. In 19115, we had a coverage result. A coverage quality result is what we would call sometimes in NASA land, they're called pixel quality reports. So they're basically a data set, the values of which are related to quality of another data set. When 19157 was created, the project team decided to drop coverage result. And so we had to amend 19157 to get that back in, because that's in many data sets, there's more quality information than there is actually physical measurements. And when that type of report got dropped, it made it impossible to describe those things. So we had to get that back in there. That coverage result is a complete coverage. So it has a spatial representation, has a variable name, all that, has types, etc. So you can completely describe those quality coverages. Process steps in the good old days. This is 19115-2 revision here. We had this thing called runtime parameters, which was a character string, and the idea was that, you could put into that character string the sort of command line parameters for some process step. Obviously, we have a lot of process steps where input parameters are more complicated than that. And to accommodate that, we added in these record and record types, which allow you to describe the format of the parameters and include multiple parameters, or even XML or JSON structures that might be, or other, could be RDF obviously, or CSV kinds of structures that you want to use to pass parameters into a process step. In some cases, process steps are parameters that have specific properties, and they might be data sets, other coverages that are in a particular file, and they may have optionalities or repeatabilities. So we borrowed from the service parameter standard the ability to describe parameters in a little bit more detail. And note that this also has a record type and a record here, so that allows you to have structures or other kinds of input things. And in fact, it could also be a source in the data file. If you have a quality, let's say that you had a quality data set that was going into a calculation as a mask or something like that, that would be you could hook that in here through this LE source element here. 19115-2 is mostly about acquisition information, and it looks sort of like this. The root element is acquisition information, and once again, we have more and more complicated data sets that have multiple data that are acquired with different sensors or in different processes. So as we saw in the case of the spatial representation, we added into acquisition information the ability to describe the elements of the data sets that are acquired using some particular platform or instrument or sensor, as we shall see. So when we start looking at things like airborne metadata or airborne data sets or complicated groups of things that scientists put together, we need ways in the metadata to connect different kinds of metadata within one metadata record, to connect them to the variables that they were involved with, or the quality information. This has existed in quality information since the beginning, but we added it into spatial representation and acquisition. Platforms and instruments have a lot of unique properties. Describing platforms or instruments is a science in itself. Things like SensorML, where we have entire markup languages for describing instruments, indicate that. In the ISO standards allow you to connect metadata from other standards into your ISO metadata records when it's necessary. So if you had platform or instrument descriptions that were written in SensorML, you could just insert those into the ISO record for either platform or instrument. And we've been experimenting on things like that with Digital Globe, and also with Landsat, where they have complex sort of specialized or custom metadata for platforms and instruments that needs to get connected into the ISO record. In NASA, when we started out with 19115-2, had only platform and instrument, and many people in NASA said, my data sets have, the instruments I use have multiple sensors. So we added another level to this hierarchy called sensor, and it's basically the same as an instrument. It also has the ability to attach things like sensor.ml or more detailed descriptions with a record and a record type, and has a citation, just like instrument and platform, to any number actually of documents that describe that sensor. So hopefully this gives us the machinery that we need to describe these multi-sensor instruments that are used in NASA and NOAA and other places. So I think that's the end. Oops, one other thing. The use case things happen. Everybody knows that instruments have problems that come and go as a function of time, and in some cases cause problems with data. So for platforms and instruments and sensors, we now have an instrumentation event list, which is a list of instrumentation events, and you can see what they look like, descriptions and extents. These events have spatial and temporal extents, and they could be any type. There's a few standard types shown there. You can see in the lower left. In this case, this whole thing should actually be red, since this was an entirely new thing. But the idea is that we can start to attach information to a metadata record that makes it that describes things that have happened to an event or to an instrument, and that would be done here, through this citation here. You could just have a citation to a list that was maintained by some other system, and that might have some constraints for access controls, but the idea is to be able to describe those events for instrumentation. So that was the last slide, and I'd be happy to try and answer questions if we have any.
Hi, Ted. This is John.
Hey, John.
Very first question, what's the dog's name?
Zoe.
Zoe. Zoe's so nice. Thank you for being a prime mover in making all of that happen to get ISO updated. I'm sure going way there. I have some clue of the amount of work that must have involved. Can you tell me, back in the day, I was very interested in getting the ISO controlled, the code lists, I think they call it, the controlled vocabularies they're used in ISO, published somewhere so that people could reference them and see them and so forth. And I think for a while, Simon or someone had produced something similar, but I think it's no longer up. Can you give me an idea of whether it's feasible, what the current status of the availability of these standards, and particularly their code lists are, and whether it would be reasonable to get them submitted to either the community ontology repository or bioportal?
A couple places. In the last few years, let's see, let me look around here and figure out my, we now have a Git repository for the, and I can put this into the chat, a Git repository for the standards. And in that Git repository, there's a directory called standards.iso.org, which mimics the structure in standards.iso.org, which is the official location for these things. Nice. And in 19115 resources, there is a directory that has code lists in two different representations. One is the cat code list. So this is historically what this looked like. This is all of the code lists in one catalog. So this is sort of a long one. And there's also an HTML representation of it here. Oops, and here we can see what the HTML looks like. And then in the GML representation, each of the code lists is in its own file. So that's one place that they're available. The other place where they are available is standards.iso.org, and same directory structure, and here's the resources, and here's the code list directory. So this is the you know, sort of the official site. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the Git repository is a little more flexible than this, and we're now trying to work with ISO to figure out how to update these things. The last time I updated them en masse, the woman who helped me with that is no longer there, and so you know, one of the challenges we have in ISO land is updating things, because their model is Word documents, not directories.
Right.
So,
right.
Hopefully those, and you know, Jean Bordour has done some stuff with most, translating most metadata, most ISO standards into ontologies. And those are also in this ISO. This is just at Git ISO TC211. The group for ontology maintenance has an ontology which is organized by standard. And let's see if we look in here. There must be some code lists. And I guess in this case, the code lists are inside of, let's see, what is this one? Inside of here somewhere. And now we're in your bailiwick, John. So I guess I should be able to do a search for code and see if there's something. I would think that somewhere in here we would have what those things might be. But I haven't looked at this representation for a while. But anyway, so there's possibly 3 different resources that might be useful.
Yeah, quite awesome. And that's just a huge amount of progress from the last time I engaged. Thank you. Can I infer that there's sufficient openness in the ISO community now that it is not a concern to repurpose the vocabularies, or is there a person I could ask you this offline too. We don't have to use up everybody's time, but
no, there's no. I think that the ISO community that I know would welcome other representations for these code lists.
Okay, super.
You know, what ISO really worries about is the things that they sell, and which are Word documents, or I guess they're PDFs with your name emblazoned on them. So, you know, this is one of the things that we're doing in order to be able to maintain these XML schema and other resources in a way that they can be updated. TC211 is negotiating with ISO and calling these things support resources rather than standards or something like that.
Yes, perfect. Yes.
And yes, when you thanked me at the beginning, you know, one of the other things that I get to do is try and make those arguments that these things should be available. So
yes,
and that was a little harder than making a standard, believe it or not.
Yeah, yeah. You've done an impressive job so far.
Well, anyway, other questions? Okay, well then I guess I will.
Ted, this is Payne.
Oh, hey, Payne.
How are you? I'm wondering those in the new improvements, are they implemented in the XML implementation, or it would take a little time to be implemented?
Yeah, I mentioned the XML repository.
Yeah.
All of these, and in this case, there is you can either clone or download this. The repository is up to date in terms of all of these changes.
Excellent.
And I have some sample, there are sample XML files that include them, and there are schemas that are in a structure very similar or identical to the structure of standards.iso.org. One thing, so the Git repository is the place to get those things, and there is a wiki here. So we did quite a bit of work on the code lists, because it turned out that the person I was working with on the code lists, we unfortunately copied some code lists from the wrong places into ISO. So there's actually Nathan Wilson, I think is his name, from NOAA, that pointed this out, as well as Anna. So we did a bunch of work on fixing the code lists recently. And there's also stuff here on all of the updates to the schemas. And, the idea, we have new versions of namespaces. So the header file that you have on your XML file references new versions. I know that many people here remember that when 19115-2 came out, the root element went from GMD to GMI, and that caused a lot of problems and consternation. So now we have different versions of the namespaces, so the prefixes stay the same. And if you want to use new capabilities, you use a different version of the namespace rather than changing the prefixes. So we hope that makes it easier. But this XML repository is where I would go to get the most common stuff.
Great, thanks.
And of course, Peng, if you or others, at anywhere have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Sounds good. I appreciate that.
And the URL for that is in the chat.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, Sean, I'm coming back at you.
All right. Thanks, Ted. Great talk. I did have one question about identifiers. I know that in dialects such as DataCite, when you use the identifier field, you're supposed to say who created that identifier. Is there a capability like that in ISO for me to say, hey, this party identifier is for is from ORCID?
Yes.
Great.
I'm just happen to be looking at the, let's see. Yeah, if you go to the ESIP wiki of all things, you want to give me, well, if we go to the ESIP wiki and search for MD_identifier, or let's say, even if we just search for identifier, it comes up second. Yeah, that shows you the elements of the, okay, now you're confusing me. Yeah. Just go, yes, go there and just search for identifier. And the second one there. Yeah, so these are the elements of the identifier. The code, which is yellow there as the only mandatory thing, would in this case be the ORCID, and the description would be ORCID ID. The code space would be whatever the ORCID sort of namespace is, and the authority would give you a chance. It's a citation. One of the nicest things we did with citations is we gave them web addresses in 19115-1. So that citation could just be a URL that pointed you to a description of ORCID, to the ORCID homepage. That's probably what I would use that for.
Okay, great.
So as other groups develop identifiers, and there are actually already other identifiers for organizations, and there's been the federal hierarchy, whatever it's called, the federal organization ID thing has been around for 1 million years. So you could have multiple identifiers for, possibly have multiple identifiers for the same person or organization that come from different sources. And you could include both of those in the metadata.
Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, is there anything that we should circle back around to and address for the session proposals? Or do all of the session leads know what they're going to do and have a plan to put these into the system before next week?
When's the deadline?
The 30th at the end of day. I've also read the 27th, though. It just depends on which document. I think the 30th is the authoritative day, though.
Correct. 30th.
Great. Thanks, Annie.
That is the authoritative authority.
Does that sound authoritative enough?
Oh, so that's a week from today.
Yes.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for teaching us about these revisions and amendments, Ted. I hope everyone has a good week, and I'm looking forward to seeing our sessions in the schedule for the meeting. All right, bye. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.